The Compact Council gave humanity exactly 1 hour to justify its continued seat at the table, and the human delegate spent 58 minutes of it fixing everyone else's problems first. It wasn't supposed to go that way. The session had been called specifically to address what three-member delegations were calling, in increasingly less diplomatic language, the human capability question, a polite way of saying several powerful species had grown uneasy enough about humanity's accelerating reach to demand a formal accounting, on the record, with consequences attached if the accounting didn't satisfy them. The format was simple and deliberately humiliating. One human representative, 1 hour, standing before the full council, addressing a list of grievances and suspicions that had been compiled over months by delegations who decided humanity's growth needed to be slowed down before anyone figured out how to stop it entirely. Director Kemi Okonkwo-Ademi, 53 years old, was the delegate sent to stand in that hour. She had not been the council's first choice for who they expected to see. They'd assumed Ambassador Maro Vazic, now 90 and fully retired, or one of the senior diplomatic corps regulars who'd built decades of relationships in that exact chamber. Instead, humanity sent someone almost nobody on the council had heard of, a systems coordinator from the UEDF's Cross-Species Technical Assistance Division, a job that existed almost entirely outside the spotlight of formal diplomacy, doing the unglamorous work of helping other species' infrastructure projects when they got stuck on problems nobody back home could solve fast enough. The Velcon representative, a careful institutionalist named Vel Sorenthal, opened the session by reading the grievance list aloud, 11 items long, covering everything from the unexplained scale of the pelagic fleet to the speed of the ascending corridor's expansion to the unsettling fact that humanity now had observer status or active partnerships with 4 species the rest of the compact had spent decades failing to even communicate with. As he finished reading, he looked at the clock. 59 minutes remained. He said, "You have the floor. Address these concerns directly, or the Council will proceed to a formal capability restriction vote." Director Okonkwo-Ademi did not move toward the podium reserved for formal responses. Instead, she said, "Before I respond to the list, I noticed something in the Chamber's environmental control readout on my way in. Your atmospheric recycling system here on Velanas thou has been running at 11% above rated efficiency loss for the past 6 weeks. That's not catastrophic, but it's the kind of inefficiency that compounds, and I'm fairly confident I know why it's happening." The chamber went very quiet. Vel Sorenthal said, "That is not relevant to this session." She said, "It might not be, but you have 59 minutes of my time guaranteed regardless of what I spend it on, and I'd rather not waste any of it pretending I didn't notice a problem I can probably help with in under 10 minutes. She walked to the chamber's environmental control terminal, a station nobody expected a diplomatic guest to even know how to access, and pulled up the recycling system's diagnostic history. She found the issue in 4 minutes. A secondary filtration valve, installed during a maintenance cycle 8 months earlier, had been calibrated to a slightly outdated specification that hadn't accounted for a software update to the primary system 3 months later. Nobody had caught the mismatch because both systems were individually functioning within acceptable parameters. It was only the interaction between them, compounding slowly, that was bleeding efficiency. She flagged the exact valve, wrote out the recalibration specification on a notepad, and handed it to the SORI facilities technician standing near the chamber's service entrance, who looked at it, looked at her, and quietly left to implement the fix. The whole exchange took 6 minutes. 53 minutes remained. Vel Sorenthal said with noticeably less certainty than before, "We would ask that you now address the grievance list." She said, "I will, but I noticed something else in the briefing materials your office sent ahead of this session." She held up the printed grievance document. She said, Item 4 references a communication delay the Velcon Collective experienced 11 months ago with one of your outer relay stations, which your delegation cited as evidence that the ascending corridor's relay infrastructure is unreliable and potentially being deliberately restricted from non-human traffic. I looked at the technical specifications of that relay station before this session because I had 11 hours notice and I wanted to come prepared. The delay you experienced wasn't deliberate restriction. It was a known bandwidth. Location issue specific to a hardware generation that station was still running at the time. We've already updated 40% of our relay chain past that hardware generation. That station is scheduled for the update in another 2 months. She paused. I can move that station up the schedule. I have the authority to reallocate the necessary technical team if I do it within the next 40 minutes, because after that, the team I'd need gets reassigned to a different priority project for 6 weeks, and you'd be waiting until next quarter instead. Vel Sorenthal said, You are offering to resolve our grievance instead of defending against it. She said, I'm offering to resolve the actual underlying problem your grievance was describing. The grievance assumed bad intent. The problem was a hardware gap. Those required different responses, and I'd rather fix the real one. She made the call. The team reassignment was confirmed in 3 minutes. 49 minutes remained. The Reach delegation's representative, who had been watching with an expression the official record would later describe only as notably altered, said, Item 7 on the list concerns the Dreshkin Bilateral Commission, which several delegations believe represents an unfair diplomatic advantage humanity has secured through methods not available to other compact members. Director Okonkwo Ademi said, I read that one too. I think the actual frustration underneath it isn't about the Dreshkin Commission specifically. It's that several delegations have wanted similar direct bilateral frameworks with species outside the compact and haven't had a template for building one that the target species would actually accept. She pulled a data pad from her bag. She said, I brought the framework template we used. Not the specific terms, those were negotiated for our situation, but the structural approach. How we built trust incrementally, what information sharing protocols we used before either side committed to anything binding, how we handled the early communication failures without letting them collapse the whole effort. It's adaptable. I can walk anyone interested through it after this session. Or I can leave the document with the Council archive right now so any delegation can study it on their own time. She set the data pad on the central table. She said, the Dreshkin Commission isn't a secret advantage. It's a template nobody asked us to share before now because the question that's actually been bothering people wasn't on the formal grievance list. It was underneath it. 41 minutes remained. Vel Sorenthal sat back in his chair, and for the first time since the session opened, he looked less like an institutionalist reading a prepared grievance and more like someone recalculating a situation that had stopped matching his expectations several minutes ago. He said, Item 9 concerns the scale of the pelagic fleet, which remains the single largest unresolved concern among delegations represented here. Director Okonkwo Ademi was quiet for a moment. She said, I'm not going to fix that one in the next 38 minutes. That's not a technical problem with a calibration error underneath it. That's a real strategic concern, and I respect it too much to pretend I can solve it with a data pad. She paused. What I can tell you is the same thing every honest answer to that question has always been. The fleet exists because we assessed a threat scenario 11 years before it became real, built the capability quietly because announcing it would have made it a target before it was finished, and have used it exactly once defensively in a situation where its existence prevented a conflict instead of starting one. I understand why that answer doesn't fully satisfy people who weren't in the room for any of those decisions. I can't make 11 years of context fit into the time we have left. What I can offer is this: full technical disclosure of the fleet's current capabilities to a joint compact review committee, with the condition that the same committee structure gets applied going forward to any species developing comparable undisclosed capability, ours included. Transparency that goes both directions, or it isn't actually transparency. The chamber held that proposal in silence for a long moment. 34 minutes remained. The Threll delegate, a careful proceduralist who had not spoken yet, finally said, "You have spent the majority of this session's time fixing problems for other delegations instead of defending your own position." Director Okonkwo Ademi said, "I don't think those are different things." The Threll delegate said, "Explain." She said every grievance on that list assumed humanity's capability was a threat because nobody could verify what it was actually being used for. I think the fastest way to answer that question wasn't to argue about it. It was to demonstrate, in real time, exactly W. Hat we do with capability when we have it available and a problem in front of us. You needed a recalibrated valve, we fixed it. You needed a faster relay update, we moved it up the schedule. You wanted a bilateral framework template, we handed it over. That's not a defense strategy. That's just what we do consistently, whether anyone is watching in a formal session or not. She looked around the chamber. The only item on this list I couldn't immediately resolve is the one that actually requires trust built over time rather than a quick fix. I'm not going to manufacture trust in the next 30 minutes by talking faster. I'd rather spend the remaining time on something that might actually be useful. She turned to the SRI representative, who had been silent the entire session, observing with the specific stillness that meant something was being filed away for later. She said, "Your Environmental Systems Division flagged a separate issue 18 months ago, a long-range sensor calibration drift affecting deep corridor survey accuracy. I read about it in an open technical bulletin your division published. Nobody's solved it yet because it requires cross-referencing a data set the ascending corridor relay chain has and your survey division doesn't have direct access to. I can authorize that data sharing in the next 20 minutes if you want it." The SRI representative said, in the specific SRI register that indicated genuine surprise, "You read our technical bulletins." Director Okonkwo Ademi said, "I read everyone's technical bulletins. It's the job. Most problems that look impossible from inside one system look solvable the moment you can see what a different system already knows." The data sharing was authorized in 14 minutes. 20 minutes remained. Vel Sorenthal looked at the grievance list, then at the chamber, then at the clock, and finally back at Director Okonkwo Ademi. He said, "We called this session to determine whether humanity's capabilities represent a threat requiring restriction." She said, "I know." He said, "You have spent 58 minutes of your allotted hour resolving 4 separate problems for 4 separate delegations, none of whom asked for your help, and none of whom you were under any obligation to assist during a session meant to scrutinize your own species." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She thought about the question for a moment, because it deserved a real answer rather than a quick one, even with the clock running. She said because the actual question this council is trying to answer isn't on the grievance list. The list is symptoms. The real question is, what does humanity do with capability when nobody is forcing it to prove anything? I could have spent an hour defending against 11 specific grievances. Instead, I spent 58 minutes just doing the thing we actually do, the way we do it on any ordinary Tuesday, with no session and no clock and no council watching. I think that answers the real question better than any defense I could have built in an hour of arguing. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Vel Sorenthal said something that would end up, eventually, in the formal session record, quoted more often in the years afterward than any other line from that day. He said, "You were given 1 hour to prove your species' worth to this council." He said, "You spent 58 minutes of it proving something else instead, and I find I no longer remember why we thought the first thing mattered more." The capability restriction vote, scheduled for immediately following the session, was withdrawn before it was called. In its place, the Council passed a much smaller, far less dramatic resolution, a standing invitation for the UEDF's Technical Assistance Division to formally expand its cross-species support role, with dedicated funding, across all 18 member species infrastructure programs. Director Okonkwo Ademi's response, recorded in the session minutes, was characteristically brief. She said, "We'd be glad to. Send the requests whenever something's broken. We're usually faster at fixing things than we are at explaining ourselves, and honestly, I think that's the better use of everyone's time." She gathered her data pads, thanked the chamber, and left with 2 minutes remaining on the clock that nobody, by that point, was still watching.